Good morning. I'm Ellen Horseman. I welcome you to Camden, Arkansas's First United Methodist Church Sunday School. We're looking at a study by a Reverend Susan Robb called 7 Words, Listening to Christ from the Cross. And we've come to chapter 3. This is the word or saying, I think I like that better, that occurs in the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Mark. In those two Gospels, it's the only thing that Jesus says from the cross. And Matthew pretty well parrots what Mark, the earlier source, says. So let me go to the Gospel of Mark, and I'm going to start in chapter 15, and I'm going to start with verse 24. So Mark 15:24. They crucified him. They divided up his clothes, drawing lots for them to determine who would take what. It was 9 a.m. when they crucified him. The notice of the formal charge against him was written, "The King of the Jews." They crucified 2 outlaws with him, one on his right and one on his left. People walked by insulting him, shaking their heads and saying, "Ha! So you were going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, were you? Well, save yourself then. Come down from the cross." In the same way, the chief priests were making fun of him among themselves and together with the legal experts. "He saved others," they said, "but he can't save himself. Let the Christ, the King of Israel, come down from the cross, and then we will see and believe." And even those who had been crucified with Jesus insulted him. From noon until 3 in the afternoon, the whole earth was dark. At 3, Jesus cried out with a loud shout, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you left me?" After hearing him, some standing there said, "Well, look, he's calling Elijah." Someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine and put it on a pole and offered it to Jesus to drink, saying, "Well, let's see if Elijah will come to take him down." But Jesus let out a loud cry and died. The curtain of the sanctuary was torn in two from top to bottom. When the centurion who stood facing Jesus saw how he died, he said, "This man was certainly God's son." So the word from the cross here, the word among the 7 words, is here in the CEB that I read to you, my God, why have you left me?" Now, you've probably heard that like I have in the more traditional translation in the NRSV or even the RSV before that, my God, why have you forsaken me?" I kind of like that wording a little bit better because to me, forsaken sounds even more intense. And I'll say something, that when we hear this word from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" There's something about it that makes it at once beautiful and yet painful, beautiful, painful, and yet mystifying. There's something that draws us to that word, and yet, what does it mean? Well, have fun trying to filter that out among what the theologians say, because you'll find theologians that will say all kinds of things about this word from the cross. Quite a few of them use these words as part of an atonement theory that sort of that God had to be satisfied that sin was taken care of. And so they say that here at this particular moment on the cross, Jesus, who himself had been without sin, now takes all the sins of all humanity upon him. And so therefore he feels the depth of the despair that comes from sin that separates us from God. And thus he cries out. The Christian church, has traditionally called this word from the cross the cry of dereliction. Now, if that sounds funny to you because of the way that we use dereliction, dereliction here meant abandonment. So this is the cry of abandonment from the cross. But then there are some who insist that, well, Jesus didn't really feel abandoned. He was simply praying from Psalm 22 here, and he was doing that for our sake, because he wants us to know that, how will I put it, that he gets it, that he understands how we feel, that when we are in despair, he wants us to know that we can find hope. Professor Halford E. Luckock, if I'm saying his name right, and do you know if I am? He's from Yale, or was from Yale Divinity, and writing in the Interpreter's Bible, he asked this question: was Jesus in the depths of despair, or was he meditating on the words of the Psalm 22 in his confidence in God's victory? Well, I'm not sure that it's an either or, which I'm pretty sure is what that professor says as well. I just don't think that we can ignore or dismiss the suffering of Jesus on the cross when he makes this cry. But at the same time, we can't ignore the hint of comfort and hope in these last words from the cross. Yeah, I think that most of us humans know what it is like to feel God forsaken, to feel abandoned and alone. If you want to hear some people feeling God forsaken, then turn on the television and listen to some of these Ukrainian people. I know you've heard them. Have you listened to some of the Ukrainians? Have you seen some of them down in, not really bomb shelters, but subways and other underground places, trying to escape bombs, trying to shelter their children with their bodies, and wondering, why is this happening to us? Or seen and heard the agonizing of women who've managed to cross over the border into Poland after days traveling there, and having not only to leave behind their home, but leave behind their husbands and their fathers, and wondering, is my husband okay? Will I ever see him again? Will I ever see my home again? No wonder these people would feel abandoned. I mean, sometimes humans, if we're honest about it, we feel abandoned by God. And every once in a while, sometimes humans will be honest enough to cry out to God when we feel abandoned. But at other times, people don't do that. They won't cry out to God. They won't say, why, God, have you abandoned me? They won't turn in prayer. Maybe sometimes what we want to do is get angry, get disappointed, and then just take off. Maybe, leave God altogether, leave the church altogether. Certainly, sometimes I think people are afraid to really give voice to how they're feeling, as if somehow it's sacrilegious. I really appreciated Reverend Rob in our book, 7 Words, because she shared a time, and here she is, a pastor, but she shared a time when she really felt forsaken by God. She talked about how her father had this terrible illness, and of course, at first the family had prayed for his healing from that. But then as they could see that he was not going to, they began to pray that he could be delivered from this pain. Well, neither one of those things happened. He was dying all right, but he was dying a slow and agonizing death. And Reverend Rob said that at one point she was so angry that, among other things, she cried out to God. She railed at God, and she said, do you hear our prayers? Do you even care? Oh, I would love an answer, but I really don't expect one anymore. Thank you, Reverend Rob, for sharing that, because what she did was give voice to what some of us feel sometimes. And Reverend Rob said that sometimes we are afraid to be this honest. We're afraid that we're going to offend God with this kind of raw honesty, as she says, as if God doesn't already know what we're feeling and we're thinking. Faithful people can sometimes feel abandoned by God. And God gives us permission to feel that. And God gives us permission to say that. If you don't believe it, look at the Psalms. There are many Psalms in which the psalmist complains to God and feels abandoned by God. And Psalm 22, which Jesus quotes from, is one of those. Reverend Rob gives another example when the Israelites feel abandoned by God. Now, never mind that as slaves in Egypt, they had seen God bring these 10 plagues to help convince Pharaoh to let them go. And never mind that they had seen the miracle of the parting of the waters of the Red Sea and had crossed safely away from the Egyptian army when they can't find water in the desert, in the wilderness, they become very frustrated. They feel abandoned by God, and they turn in their anger to Moses, and they say to Moses, "Why did you bring us out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst? Is the Lord among us or not?" Oh, I love that. Is the Lord among us or not? Is God with me or not? Have you ever felt that way? Have you ever felt abandoned like that? Have you ever wondered if God is really there at all? Makes me think of the title of a Judy Blume book. What was it called? Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret. Is the Lord among us or not? My God, why have you forsaken me? Have you known those depths of despair? Maybe you're feeling it right now. Well, friends, Jesus also has known that despair, as this cry from the cross shows us. Here's Jesus. And my God, why have you forsaken me? Now, at this point, Jesus, the human, has endured an awful lot. Think about it. He's been betrayed by one of his closest friends and one of his apostles, his special people. He has been abandoned by all the rest of them. He has been falsely accused. He has been slapped. He has been mocked. He has been beaten. He has been whipped. He is so weak that while he's being required to carry the cross to his own crucifixion, he can't even do it. They have to get somebody to help him. And then when they get to the cross, and he's been up all night long, and I'm sure he hasn't had anything to eat, now his hands and feet are driven through with nails, nailing him to the cross. And at the point when he makes this cry, he's been on the cross for 3 hours. And of course, in crucifixion, when they're hanging, the whole weight of the body is hanging from those hands, those arms. The only way that the person's suffering on the crucifix can breathe is to take those feet to that little spot that they build for him and push up. So pushing up in agony to breathe and then back down again. No wonder after all that he's been through in 3 hours of this agony, Jesus feels abandoned and cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" You know, Reverend Rob says that some people will wonder, well, how can Jesus, if he was part of the Trinity, if he was indeed fully divine as he was fully human, how could he wonder if God had abandoned him? But friends, it's the fact that Jesus was fully human that makes this make sense. Jesus was fully human, and at this point he was feeling what all of us have felt. He was feeling humiliation and betrayal and pain and suffering and abandonment. He was feeling forsaken by God. Dennis Bratcher, who's a Nazarene minister and professor, says of this very human moment, this moment depicts Jesus as a human being, dying in agony and abandoned by humanity. In that moment, Jesus even feels abandoned by God. Yet in a move typical of lament psalms, he still cries out to God. The irony is that in his feelings of abandonment, he still cries out, my God. It is not a positive cry of faith. It is a visceral response from the depths of human suffering. Yet it is a cry that turns to God. That tells us something important about what it means to be a human being. Yes, this is a visceral response from the depths of human suffering. But yes, it also turns towards God. In the midst of despair, Jesus turns towards God. The cry that he gives here, this, my God, why have you forsaken me, is from Psalm 22. It is, in fact, the first verse of Psalm 22. And Psalm 22, like a lot of other psalms, is a complaint psalm. But like those complaint psalms, it will move towards praise. Now, I did a lesson on this psalm on February the 13th. And so if you didn't hear it or you didn't watch the video and you're curious about really understanding the psalm, you can turn back. That was on February the 13th. I sound like I'm making an advertisement for my own video. And I must admit, I went back and listened to it myself so that I could remember fully what I had studied about Psalm 22. And I thought, well, that's not a bad lesson. Might have been even good. Oh, wait, I'm off talking about what a great teacher I am. But seriously, I think that you really understand this cry from the cross, and because I think that Jesus is kind of pointing towards the whole psalm, as we will discuss in just a minute. And so it really helps to understand the full depth of where that psalm goes. But perhaps I should get back into my lesson here. This is the first verse, as I said, from Psalm 22. And it's not, it's a very complex psalm. It's one of the more complex, and I might say even more beautiful of the psalms. But it's no wonder that Jesus would think of Psalm 22, because listen to some of the complaints from Psalm 22 and then tie that back in to the, well, I'm going to sneeze here. Excuse me just a minute. Tie that back into what we just read in the Bible. Pardon me, but aren't you glad that you're not anywhere near? You don't have to worry about those germs. Okay, from the psalm. The psalmist complains in Psalm 22, I'm just a worm, less than human, insulted by one person, despised by another. All who see me make fun of me. They gape, shaking their head. He committed himself to the Lord, so let him rescue him. Let God rescue him. Let God deliver him if God likes him so much. Doesn't that sound a lot like these people mocking Jesus at the cross that Mark records here in his chapter 15? And also in verse 18 of this psalm, it says, they divide my clothes among themselves, and for my clothing they cast lots. Well, I didn't read that in this selection of Mark, but right before that, sure enough, they're casting lots for his clothing. So no wonder Jesus is thinking about that psalm, because he's suffering the same thing as the psalmist of Psalm 22 does. And while Psalm 22, where that psalmist begins in despair, feeling forsaken and crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me? And going on to say, I cry for you by day, but you don't answer me. While he starts off like that, this psalmist moves along in this complaint, Psalm 22, until he reaches the point kind of midway through the psalm where he recognizes that God is with him in the midst of his deepest troubles. He says, from the horns of the wild oxen. And the horns of the wild oxen was a metaphor that meant from a terrible, terrible suffering and difficult situation. From the horns of the wild oxen, he said, you have answered me. So the psalmist realizes that God hasn't completely forsaken him, that God has answered him. The psalmist realizes that though his troubles and tortures might persist, he is not alone. God is with him in the midst of his struggles. And the psalmist will end his psalm with a declaration that every nation will remember and come back to the Lord. Every family among all nations will worship God. His final words in that psalm show a faith in the resurrection, for he says that even the dead and the dying will praise God. Yes, this word from the cross is meant to lead us to the hopefulness that ends Psalm 22. I believe that. I mean, Jesus and his contemporaries would have known this psalm very well, because the Psalms were their songbook. And so they would have sung this in worship. And so Reverend Rob says it's just like if somebody were to start the song, let's see, like This Little Light of Mine, most of the rest of us could finish out the song. If you hear someone start Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound, then most of the rest of us can go ahead and finish singing. We can hop in and sing that song with that person. We know where the song's going because we've heard it so many times. And Reverend Rob says that's the way it would have been for the followers of Jesus when they hear that word that he struggles to give them from the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? So if they had, in their minds at least, repeated the psalm, they would have realized that in spite of the despair, it ends in hopefulness. In spite of the feeling of being forsaken, the psalmist realizes that God is with him. So just as the psalmist has learned that nothing can separate him from God, Jesus wants us to understand, because that's what the psalmist realizes. He realizes, and I think I talked about this in my lesson on Psalm 22, he realizes at the end of his psalm that nothing can separate him from God. Not pain, not suffering, not even death itself. And so here, just as the psalmist of Psalm 22 has learned that nothing can separate him from God, Jesus wants us to understand when we hear that word from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus wants us to understand that we are not alone, that Jesus has felt our very pain, that Jesus knows what we are suffering. In the midst of our suffering, Jesus is with us, hearing our cries, walking with us through darkness and leading us to light and victory. For surely as Jesus turned towards God there on the cross and in his pain and suffering, he knew, like the psalmist, that God would give the final victory. And Jesus wants us to know that he is with us when we are hurting, and he is with us when we feel abandoned, and he will lead us to light and victory. And finally, Reverend Rob says that this word from the cross, as well as an assurance, I mean, I love it because it is an assurance because it lets me know that Jesus was fully human, and it lets me know that Jesus really understands how I feel when I'm really down. But it also, as we've said, lets us know that Jesus is moving us towards hopefulness. But Reverend Rob says that this word from the cross is also a challenge to us to remember other people who are feeling alone, to remember other people who feel despair, who feel that they are God forsaken. She said we need to be like Simon the Cyrene was for Jesus, and to help those people carry their cross and to help them turn towards God in their anguish, just as Jesus did on the cross. I'm going to read you what she says near the end of this chapter, because she did a little bit better job than what I'm doing. So let Reverend Rob more or less have the last word. If we follow the way of the cross, she says, if we follow the way of the cross, we will encounter those along our road who are sick and suffering. Those who ask the all too human question, God, why have you forsaken me? By walking along with them, by helping to carry their burden, we have an opportunity to remind them how the psalm ends, not with isolation, but with Easter. Through our actions, we help deliver the good news. God is here, and you are not forgotten. Suffering does not get the last word. Human fear and violence do not get the last word. Love has the last word. Pick up someone's cross and be the message. My friends, God is with us in life, in death, in life beyond death. God loves us and is with us. Thanks be to God, who gives us the victory through Jesus Christ our Lord. All of you have a good week, And to my Sunday school class, I shall look forward to being with you again next week. Bye-bye, and God bless you.